Hi, BookTube, it's Amy. I'm back with another segment of my 2024 bookshelf tour. And I thought we would skip over this shelf for now. We'll come back to that and go to the third shelf down the wall where there are some more books on books. And I thought we'd start down on the bottom of the shelf with some of these books on books. So I'll just get myself down here on the floor. So we'll start on the end here, where there is a book by Egerton Castle on English Bookplates. Now, it's not in great condition at all. As you can see, the spine is a little bit torn there, but the boards are still attached. The stitching is still intact. It's really just that cloth that has split there. And Egerton Castle is an interesting author. This is one of his nonfiction books, but I've read and have elsewhere on my shelf one of his novels, which is a kind of a very melodramatic gothic romance. And this one's very cool because, as you can see, the previous owner or previous owners have really gone to town with the marginalia in here. So we have March 1901, and there is a book plate in here from Leonard Charles Price. Some writing from 1902. Someone has added an XLibris, something labeled XLibris, a paste in of page numbers and book plates. I'm assuming those are ones they want to refer easily to. Someone has posted in a review of the book. It's a little bit dirty, but the images in it, the illustrations, are absolutely gorgeous. Just peel back the tissue guard there so you can see the title page. And so it really just is a guide to book plates. Not really applicable to me because I am not buying the kind of books where I would find these, early English book plates. But it is quite interesting if you're interested in book plates or early books, early printing. So there's that one, and I'll just leave that off for now to make the shelf more accessible. Next to that, we have Early Printers and Printing in the Canadas by H. Pearson Gundy, published by the Bibliographical Society of Canada in Toronto in 1964. And as you can see, it's just a small book with a lot of facsimiles of early printing that does exactly what it says in the title. It deals with the earliest printers in Upper and Lower Canada. So there's that one. Next to that is Typographic Years, A Printer's Journey Through a Half Century by Joseph Blumenthal, 1925 to 1975. The dust jacket is in nice condition on this one. And this is about a particular printer, Joseph Blumenthal. If you like memoir or printing history, this is an interesting one. And oh, look in there. There's a bookmark that my sister made for me out of various layers of paper and cardboard and some lamination. And this one is 1982, so it is a more recent publication. It almost would belong up with the newer books on books, but it's ended up shelved here with the older books on books. Then we have a fun one. Here is the Peppercorn Papers by Claude A. Prance. As you can see, it's a library discard. We've got the call number on the spine there. Discarded from the Mount Allison Memorial University Memorial Library. 1964, and this is a great collection of essays on books and book collecting, and there's one particular essay in here that led me to purchasing a bunch of books on book collecting, a bunch of other earlier essay collections, and there's an essay in here on Charles Lamb, which was sort of a nice parallel because around the same time that I was reading the Peppercorn Papers, I had picked up the collection of the works of Charles Lamb that I showed in my previous video. There's essays on book stalls, on the Library of Charles Lamb, on Thomas Fuller, on association copies. Association copies are books that, in most cases, they're books that were owned by somebody famous or notable, or somebody who knew the author. But this essay, My Books About Books, I created a list, a big list in August when I read this, and then I placed an order for about, I think somewhere between 12 and 15 books on book collecting and essays and literature. So that is one of my favorites. If you're able to find a copy of that, I would highly, highly recommend it. I'll see if I can slide these ones gently back onto the shelf here. Because next, we're pulling out one titled Canadiana on Your Bookshelf by C.B. Thurbage. Not the most interesting book, I would say, for people outside of Canada, even if you're into book collecting. Not the most interesting book for me. You can pick it up really, really cheaply online. I think, I paid maybe $3 for my copy plus the shipping. But it is about the categories of Canadiana, Canadian literature. It was published in 1976. Or at least the categories as they were seen in the 70s. And so there are, sections in here on early printed literature in Canada, on the Jesuits, works in Upper and Lower Canada, frontier literature, early 19th century ledgers, not my collecting interest to collect ledgers, but a lot of Canadiana collecting, at least the categories as they were defined in the 20th century, seems to be, people who collect literature on agriculture, or collect, books about canals, or books about farming or lumber, or that kind of thing. What you would think of as like stereotypical nation building books. Whereas I think if someone were to define the categories of Canadiana that could be collected now, it would be a lot broader, especially given the sort of influence and influx of fiction writers in the second half of the 20th century. And of course in 76, that fiction, it was there, but it hadn't made quite as big of an impact on the collecting scene. So there's that, and I'll just leave that off for now so I can pull out the next two easily. Because next we have a couple of slim volumes here called Miscellany 1 and Miscellany 2. The first one, Papers on Books and Book Collecting, and Further Papers on Books and Book Collecting. And these are by the Ottawa Book Collectors, which appears to have been a society in place in the 80s into the 90s. They don't seem to exist anymore, as there is almost literally no trace of them online anywhere. But the members of that society or club got together, and a number of them wrote essays on their collecting interests, and they published them in these two volumes here. And I found the second one first And I enjoyed it so much and was so intrigued that I sought out number 1 online. My first attempt to buy number 1 did not go well because oddly enough, it was from a seller in the United States. So somehow a volume about book collecting published in Ottawa by a small society made its way all the way down to the States. But the first time I attempted to buy it, and there's only 250 copies. The first time I attempted to buy it, the seller couldn't find it in their inventory. It had gone missing. The second time I attempted to buy it, also once again, I think maybe from a seller in the States, or I think maybe the second one I did find from a Canadian bookseller, but they were able to find it. And this one is signed by George Allen, one of the authors of this book, and there is a wonderful essay in here on the Newton sale, which of course is A. Edward Newton. And as we work through these shelves, I will eventually get to my A. Edward Newton collection and show you those catalogs from the sale in the 40s. So we'll pop those back on the shelf. Next to that we have one titled Living with Books by Helen Haynes. And it is more of a textbook, almost a textbook for librarians. So it's the art of book selection. And there's some sections, well, you can see here it's dedicated to librarians. Originally published in 1935 and revised in the 50s. And this is the 7th printing from 1957 of that second edition. But there's chapters in here on what makes a good book, what kind of book should be, selected, how to choose a valuable book, how to review a book, physical aspects of books, history of books, bibliography, how books are made, all sorts of good stuff, how to choose travel books, how to choose, nature and science books, poetry books, literature and essays, religion, sociology. So probably not, well, I suppose it could be relevant to, contemporary librarians. But as a book, just for a book lover to read, I quite enjoyed working my way through it. So we'll slide that back in there. And then we have, and this is just, a print-on-demand reprint of a title I wanted that I purchased off of Amazon. Fleury Mesplet, The First Printer at Montreal by R.W. Robert Wallace McLaughlin. And as you can see, I have some notes in here. But it's just a small historical work about the first printer at Montreal, or at least the first known printer to set up shop in Montreal. And he was actually one of the first printers in what we now refer to as the country of Canada. One of the earliest printers, or perhaps what is considered the earliest printer, was actually a printer in Halifax in 1751. But Mesplet, he published newspapers, he published some religious and political works as requested, and he had some decent contracts, but he got himself into a little bit of trouble with authorities, and it's quite an interesting story. Interesting, too, to reflect on how much freedom to publish has grown, since 300-400 years ago. Now you can pretty much publish anything you want, but in the early days of printing presses in North America, what you could and could not publish was tightly controlled, I think in almost all countries, certainly in British North America. And if you published things that you didn't have, a license to publish, if you published on paper that you didn't have purchased, that you hadn't purchased, from the correct crown licensed corporation that didn't have that, specific watermark, you could get yourself in a lot of legal trouble, as Mesplet found out. So we'll put that one back, and then there's another one here on The Art of the Bookplate by James P. Keenan. And I'm fascinated by bookplates, but not enough to make it one of my collecting interests. And this one is interesting too because it's looking at American bookplates and at some 20th century bookplates. But it is just a nice brief history with lots of wonderful illustrations here. Something I would recommend if you just want to, look at the images and reproductions of bookplates. Nice little book. So we'll put that one back on the shelf. Pull this out so that I can try to get it back in. The next one is on bookplates as well. So this is XLibris, The Art of Bookplates by Martin Hopkinson. And this one is published by the British Museum. And so these will be bookplates that are in their collection. Once again, some great illustrations in this one. Great bookplates if you're at all interested in looking at bookplates or anything about history of bookplates. There is a nice introduction here about early bookplates, the purpose of bookplates, and how they've changed in their usage today. Then we have a Pelican paperback, 500 years of printing, with 32 plates. This one has been on my shelf, but this one I'm thinking I have not read. It's the sort of thing that I will probably throw into a bag at some point when I have a long train ride in front of me. Then here is a useful little book. It's been republished many times in many editions. I have a copy of the 6th edition. It's by John Carter, titled ABC for Book Collectors, revised by Nicholas Barker. And it's a great reference guide if you're interested in terminology surrounding books. It's more or less a little dictionary, a little glossary of terms. And so if you ever come across, a term in a book listing, errata, for instance, is, a little slip of paper that's often pasted into a book if an error hasn't been detected until after publishing and they don't want to go and reprint all those pages again. But little things like that, you might see those in a description of a book that you're looking to buy, and you might wonder what that is. And this useful little book will allow you to look it up with a great degree of accuracy. These are sort of agreed upon, commonly used definitions. Engraved title, edition, impression. Now, of course, you will still come across terms where, Carter and Barker and their contemporaries had agreed upon how to use that term, but booksellers or book collectors either were using it a little bit differently in some places and in some cases back in that day, or it's now used a little bit differently now. So we'll pop that back on the shelf. Then we have a enjoyable collection of essays, A Book of One's Own, People and Their Diaries by Thomas Mallon. And this one I think is from the 80s. Yeah, 84. And it is a collection of essays or chapters on diary keeping. So travel diaries, chronicles, diaries of pilgrims, diaries of creators, artists, writers, and so on and so forth. And I quite enjoyed it. And it led me to putting a few more books on my to-buy list, as books on books often do. Now these next two may seem a little bit out of place, but I don't really have a separate section for this sort of thing, so they're just, shelved with the books on books. But I have Helene Hoff's 84 Charing Cross Road, which is her sort of little memoir about her correspondence in the mid-20th century with a bookstore in London. She lived in the United States, and she would write, and the booksellers would write back to her and send her books. There's another book by her here, Q's Legacy, which sort of continues on her writing about books and reading and some of her favorite authors and how they've influenced her. So that is a great one if you've read 84 Charing Cross Road or seen the film adaptation. You might like Q's Legacy as well. So next to that is a book called The Lost Library by Walter Mehring, and it's a little bit of a dark one. Mehring writes about how he had to flee Nazi-occupied Europe and leave his library behind. And he kind of muses on that, muses on, I guess, the social and political situation of the day. And it's a little bit, it kind of tugs at your heart, breaks your heart a little bit, just thinking of him, leaving all these books, leaving these books that belonged to, not just to him, but the library his father had built. And then, getting those boxed up and crated out and brought to him. And I think it's Paris. And then, later on having to once again pick up and leave and move again. And I don't think this one has ever been reprinted, so if you're wanting to read it, you will have to go probably and find a vintage copy. 1951. Yeah, he describes it as an autobiography of culture, and it's translated by Richard and Clara Winston. If you're going into it thinking you're going to get a straight autobiography, though, do be aware it is more of a collection of essays where he does muse on that culture, but it's really those personal bits that made me enjoy it so much. So he says the last place I felt at home was Vienna. This was before Vienna fell, and I was still surrounded by the books of my father's library. And then he dives into that first chapter talking about the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen. So it's quite an interesting book. Next to that, and I see we're at 22 minutes, but I'm going to finish out this shelf. Next to it is the Falladin Papers by Viscount Grey of Falladin. Once again, another book on books. Collection of essays from 1926. There is a duck here because there is an essay about, I know there's one about the pleasures of nature. There's one about fishing. Yes, and there is one about waterfowl. For some odd reason, I don't quite know how it ended up that way, but a lot of, early collections of essays about book collecting. Fishing seems to be a common area of collecting. Books on fishing, books on fish, essays on fishing. But this is great. The Pleasures of Reading is a wonderful essay. I enjoyed the Pleasure in Outdoor Nature essay as well. Wasn't quite so enamored with the ones on waterfowl and fly fishing, but the essay on Wordsworth, Prelude, was also a good one there. The next one I haven't read. I've thought about getting rid of it several times, but I do like a collection of letters to dip into every now and then. This is the letters of Tobias Smallet. It's a library discard, as you can see. 1926. And that's more or less all I know about it. I don't know anything about Tobias Smallet. I just saw the particular edition the book was published in, saw it was a collection of letters, and thought it might be something up my alley. Next to it we have Obdon and Other Capers by John H. Jenkins, Confessions of a Texas Bookmaker. And this one is from the second half of the 20th century in the United States, dealing with kind of book forgery and a few anecdotes about suspicious deaths, suspicious forgeries, things that may have been forgeries that weren't discovered until later. Next to that we have the book On Books and Art by Frederick Wedmore. This one is not in great condition, a little bit discolored, and the leather on the spine feels rough, as though it was wet at some point. So this is On Books and Art, 1899, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London. And it is a collection of essays on some of my favorite topics. Rare books, Balzac, George Eliot, not one of my favorites, but I did enjoy that essay. Rembrandt, that was a nice one. The Duchess of Malfi, Macbeth, which is my favorite Shakespeare play. French 18th century painting. Once again, just a nice collection of essays on books. If you're at all interested in reading books on books. Then we have a couple of new ones shoved in here because the previous section, that shelf was full. So we have The Last Bookseller, A Life in the Rare Book Trade by Gary Goodman, which is just a nice little memoir published in the last couple of years, I think, about the owner of a rare bookshop. Yep, 2021. The owner of a rare bookshop in, I'm trying to remember the name of the city, but somewhere in the United States, in Minnesota. How he came to own that bookshop, what a disaster it was at the start, how he made something of it, and eventually how he got out of the book trade. And it sort of is a post-mortem on physical used bookshops in the late 20th, early 21st century. Next to that, my copy of Sarah Bakewell's At the Existentialist Cafe, Freedom Being, and Apricot Cocktails. A wonderful nonfiction book that introduced me to some of the philosophies of Albert Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, and Jean-Paul Sartre. And it's an overview of the development of existentialism in French culture, French intellectual culture in the mid-20th century. Next to that, A Factum in the Book Trade by Marius Kajowski. Once again, a memoir, and once again, sort of a recently published book. Let's see. Yeah, 2022. This one has a little bit more depth to it, I would say, than The Last Bookseller. And I enjoyed that one a little bit more. This next one, also a recent publication, Once Upon a Tome by Oliver Darkshire. The Misadventures of a Rare Bookseller. It was okay. Published in, I think maybe last year, even in 2023. Yeah, so it was published in the United Kingdom in 22, and the first American edition was 2023. I think this is the American edition here. Sometimes it's hard to tell because in Canada we sort of get a mix of the UK and the American editions, I guess depending on which edition the booksellers or book chains have decided to purchase, or which edition, I suppose, the Canadian distributor has decided is best for the Canadian market. But this is about a younger bookseller who sort of stumbles into rare book selling by accident. And he's a little bit flippant, I would say, with his description of some aspects of the book trade. There are some funny stories, but at the same time, some of it is a little bit, yeah, okay, like, sure, fine, I'm not sure why you're telling this story. Surely there are booksellers with more interesting stories than some of the ones in that book. Then we have one last book on the end here, and this is a novel titled The Bankrupt Bookseller by Will Y. Darling. And it's actually two books in one. There's a wonderful John Lloyd XLibris bookplate in the front of this. 1947, as I said, two books in one. So it is actually The Private Papers of a Bankrupt Bookseller from 31, and The Bankrupt Bookseller Speaks Again from 38. And this collected volume is from, it was first published in 47. And so it is, or it purports to be, the papers of a deceased bookseller discovered after his death. The first one is said to be, edited to what's most interesting. And the second book is like, well, here's some more papers from him that you may find of interest. And so the plot / time period sort of overlap between the two volumes, but both are absolutely delightful if you love to immerse yourself in the world of books and book collecting and book selling. So that is one more layer. If we go up here, we'll see there's more on book collecting, and there's Shakespeare, and there's more books on book collecting and essays. And way up at the top is my J.M. Barrie, Hugh Thompson collection. But we'll leave it at that for now.